Well, good morning. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Heather Conley, Director of our Europe program here, and I have been looking forward to this conversation for an awfully long time. We are so delighted to have Ivan Krastev with us, Chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, Bulgaria, and for the purposes of today, author of After Europe, which it is a short book, but a powerful book, and thinking through and about Europe's future, something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about. Whenever Ivan is in town, I try to get on his dance card because he is one of the most insightful individuals that I know. It's a pleasure to read you in the New York Times from time to time, so we thought we'd take this hour to talk not only about the book, but to use this opportunity, Ivan, to talk about Europe's future. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I thought what we could do, with your permission, is just sort of jump in and have a conversation, and beginning with, in part, your thesis of the book in looking at Europe's disintegration. And that's a very provocative thought in and of itself. And your principal view that the migration crisis is going to be really the critical issue that is, in fact, placing Europe at this risk of disintegration. And I would just welcome you, any opening reflections, and then I'd love to dig in some of the critical themes that you were talking about. But welcome, we are delighted to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for your coming. These days, basically, when American and Europeans meet, this is like the story of the two fortune tellers that met at the center of Sofia, and one said to the other, "You're okay, how am I?" So everybody basically tries to get from the other how it works and so on. No, listen, the book sounds more apocalyptic than in fact it is, and my original title was Habsburg. I do believe European project is still open-ended. But there's three major points that I'll try to make just as an introduction to this. One is, you know that there are many theories of European integration, but there is no theory of European disintegration. And this is not by accident. Because in a certain way, one of the way the European project was constructed was to try to make disintegration unthinkable. Unfortunately, after the financial crisis and migration crisis, it is not unthinkable. And my personal kind of a scholar experience, I have never been a specialist on European integration, but I have been doing some work on how Soviet Union collapsed, how Yugoslavia collapsed, and nevertheless, we're talking about very different projects. There's certain things that should be, in my view, taken into consideration. And one is that disintegration quite often is an intended consequence of a certain type of policies. You does not need to have the majority of people that want this project to be over for the project to collapse. In many cases, it's like a run on a bank. The very fear that it can disintegrate pushes governments to start doing things which are going to lead to disintegration. And from this point of view, I do believe that the migration crisis plays a very important role, because this is the only pan-European crisis. And paradoxically, it touches even countries that does not have a single migrant. Because part of the story with the migration crisis is that I do believe it was slightly misunderstood, particularly from outside. Listen, if you talk on the terms of how many people came to Europe since 2015, it's not so much. Look at it, we're talking about around 2 million people. European Union is a quite big place. There are more people in Turkey than in the European Union as a whole. Talking as a percent of population, the number of refugees being in Jordan is a much higher percent than the one being in Germany. So from this point of view, what we're talking is not so much the number of the people that came, but the migration crisis has the same effect on the European political imagination what 9/11 has on the American political imagination. In certain terms, 3,000 people being killed in New York is also not the worst thing that has happened ever, but it pushed very much Americans to see the world in a different way. In the same way, migration crisis basically, in a certain way, provoked certain type of anxieties and fears. It has, in many cases, nothing to do with the migrants themselves. Let's give you one kind of argument which probably could be surprising for many of you. If you see at the votes in different countries after the migration crisis, you're going to be surprised that the highest support for populist parties is not coming from the areas in which you had most foreigners that came. It comes from the areas where most people has left these places in the last 20, 25 years. It is not so much about the fear of people coming. This is also the trauma of the people that has left. And this is particularly clear in Central and Eastern Europe. And by the way, the German elections have been great in this because the East-West divide go in Germany itself. For example, you can see in East Germany, a place which has one of the lowest number of refugees that have been settled, the highest support for Alternative for Germany. Why I'm saying this? Because the migration crisis, in my view, should be understood not simply as a movement of people, but as a migration of votes and migration of arguments. One of the things that totally changed with the migration crisis was basically the collapse of the center-left. It didn't start with this crisis, but in a certain way, it was very much being seen there, because at the moment when there is no idea of the perspective of the global communist revolution, there is no reasons for the working class to be internationalist, neither in economic terms nor in cultural terms. My second and last point, in order to go into the real conversation, is, and while most people now are very much focusing on the institutional differences and basically solutions, I do believe that in order to understand the crisis, we should keep in mind also one major divisions between West and East of Europe that normally is not taken seriously. And this is that it's not about interests, it's not about values, it's not about incomes. The difference is that all East Europeans has a disintegration of the major political system in their personal life experience. We have been seeing it collapsing. And believe me, in 1980s, communism in Bulgaria looked quite stable. You easily can see how you're retiring there. So from this point of view, we know how quickly certain processes can develop. This is the shock of how quickly things can change. And every single East European, regardless of his political positions, basically power, has this as a personal biography. On the West, it's not the case. None of the Westerners has this type of experience. And as a result of it, you're going to see a strange phenomenon in Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, that support for the European Union in general is very high in Central and Eastern Europe, even now. Do you know who are the most pro-European public opinions in the European Union according to the last EU poll? Poland and Hungary. Poland and Hungary. This was the Eurobarometer, basically the last one, do you have positive, negative? But as a result of this fear, you're going to see people hedging. You start to behave in the way that if something going wrong, you're not going to be on the losing side. And this type of a logic, in my view, is going to be very important to understand, in my view, certain things that can happen. So I'll stop here because I do believe that we can, yeah.
Now, you've already started us off in a wonderful way. I think in the book you note that you view migration as the new revolution. And it's not a revolution to change governments, it's a revolution to change countries because of mobility. And this is sort of your point about you can, the depopulation, the brain drain, you can move. And that in itself is a revolutionary act. You're not staying to change that government. And I think that to me was a new way of thinking. I'd love, because you mentioned it, Ivan, to turn to populism. We are struggling with a definition of that populism. It's sort of, everyone has a different reflection. If I may, I'd like to read a quote from the book that I have to say, for me, captured something that I had not heard. So please forgive me, I'm going to read for just a moment. New populist leaders don't fantasize about changing their societies. They don't imagine people in terms of what they might become. They like them just the way they are. Empowering people without any common project is the ambition of the new populism. In this sense, the new populism is perfectly suited to societies where citizens are consumers above all else and view their leaders as waiters who are expected to move quickly in fulfilling their wishes. So it's this superficiality of, this is not about the vision, the hope, what we would probably in an American term, sort of that American dream of working better, doing hard, putting that hard work in, achieving. The populist is, we loving you the way you are, and I will tell you what you want to hear and try to fulfill that quickly. That to me was striking and captures for me in some ways the superficiality of populism. Easy slogans will tell you what you want to hear, but this isn't about looking at how to improve where we are.
No, I do believe it's very important that, at least for me, it's very important that people pretend that populism is the way we see now is coming from 19th century and so on, and there is a history of the populist movement, but there is something about the current consumer society that makes this populism different. Listen, go to the old Christian democratic parties, or go to the communist parties. All of them are pedagogical projects. They don't like the people in the way they are. They like them in the way they could be. But, and all of them are trying to produce a new person, different definition of what this new person is. Look at the populist leader. The most important thing that the populist leader is saying is, I don't want to change your opinion at all. I'm ready to represent it in the way it is. I'm going to basically do what you're saying in your kitchen, no political correctness. So from this point of view, one of the important, for me at least, parts of the book is we like to talk a lot about the crisis of democracy in the EU. European Union was never a classical democratic project. So from this point of view, to talk so much about the crisis of democracy of the EU, there is something insincere about it. European Union was never basically, the very idea of the European demos was in question. What in my view is in crisis is the meritocratic vision of society. And from this point of view, the question that I do believe is quite important, and it's in my view relevant to the United States too, is the following. Why people who are ready to give all their money to send their kids to study in the best universities do not want to be governed by people who have graduated these universities? Because when I say anti-meritocratic, the problem is that, look at the Brussels elite. You can like or dislike these bureaucrats, but at least there are three things about them that you can agree. This is not the most corrupt elites that you know. From where I'm coming, to be honest. Secondly, most of these people have a quite humble backgrounds. They made their careers through education and getting exams. In a certain way, this is an exam-giving class. And thirdly, they have been succeeding according to the rules. So why they're so resented? And they are resented. And here's my explanation, and I do believe, by the way, I could be wrong, but I do believe that education for the liberalism plays the same role the nationalization of the means of production play for Marxism. Basically, this is the answer to any type of a difficult question that you face. When you don't know about certain situation, what is happening, you're talking about education. But the biggest problem is that meritocratic society creates a society where not simply the difference and the gap between winners and losers is very big, but also it creates a very arrogant winners. Exactly because I did it the right way. I did it through education, through effort, and so on. I don't owe anything to anybody. And secondly, part of these new meritocratic elites, they're very mobile. I can come and work in CSIS, I can stay in Bulgaria, I can go here, I can go there. But most of the people who are voting, they don't have this exit option. So the clash between the meritocrats and the populists is becoming the clash between two different visions of society. Meritocrats are saying society is like school. We go, there are exams, some are doing better than others, they succeed. Populists said, no, society is like family. I should help you not because you deserve it, but because you're part of the family. And I do believe this is critically important because this clash between the exit-minded elites and a kind of a rooted public is becoming dramatic. In Bulgaria, I noticed in the last 10 years the following change. 10 years ago, speaking a foreign language probably is going to increase very much the possibility that you're going to be elected. I mean, particularly electoral politics, making career. These days, to be honest, if you don't speak foreign language, you're going to be easier elected, because people say, this one at least should stay with us. He cannot go somewhere else. And from this point of view, if you look, who are the only elites that now are kind of more trusted, and this is true very much also in this country? The military. Because they're perceived as the only ones who has they're ready to sacrifice. They're a certain way doing this, the family part of it. And I do believe this is critically important, because it is exactly the mistrust towards meritocratic elites that is making so difficult for the European project to really legitimize itself. And I do believe it's something which is not a European problem only, but in Europe more than anywhere else, it was the meritocratic elites that have been at the heart of the project, exactly because it is not a community based on the idea of a common demos.
So how do we sort of fuse those two? Because in some ways, just taking sort of the examples of, as we like to say, the generals or the military, in some ways they represent both. They are both meritocracy.
Yeah.
They have worked their way up. They are professionally successful. They are well educated, multiple degrees, yet they still sort of enshrine that sense of nationalism, defense of the nation and country. So how do we return the elite, and then we use that establishment, we don't have better terms for that. How do we return them to the policy, the community of policies, meaning that meritocracy, which you're right, sort of supports itself. That's the draining the swamp. That's it. You know, the meritocracy just supports itself in some ways and does not care about others. How do we return and fuse those two? I think that's America's trick. I think that is in part for much of the EU. How do you do that?
For me, this is this is really the bigger question, because, listen, we normally assume that education is closing the gap. But now if you go to some of the new data, you're going to see that it's very much kind of consolidating the gap. My famous example is there is a Shanghai private school, and because there is a huge, as you can imagine, competition for talent, and because the good schools are very much in demand, they have an interview and tests not only the students who want to join the school giving the tests, but also the parents. They want to be sure that their smart kids come from smart families. This is in a certain way just the opposite to the very idea of what education should do. And the interesting story is, if you go back in history, you're going to be surprised to see that there was a lot of privilege on the side of the elites, but this privilege going with the fact that in the time of crisis, this is the elites that are going to take the biggest shock. In Britain, during the First World War, the percent of people from the high class who died during the war was 35% higher than people from the lower classes who died during the war. So you basically, at the moment of a most kind of a critical moment for the community, you can rely on these people. They're going to stand. And from this point of view, nationalism was very strong part of the legitimacy of these elites, that you know that when there's going to be a war and so on, they're going to stay. I do believe what has changed dramatically is that you have a globalization of the elites because of professions, because of the fact that you have a much more convertible type of a knowledge and competence. And then people are not sure that if the crisis comes, these people are going to stay with them. And to be honest, people have a good reasons not to be sure. If you look at the Greek crisis and to see how much money have been taken out of Greece at the moment when basically the crisis started, you're going to see that it's very difficult for the elites to say we're in the same boat, because we are not in the same boat. And from this point of view, the changing nature also of capital, if you're a landowner, you cannot simply take your land and go to the United States. You should stay. You should fight for this place. If basically your assets are mainly financial assets, you're like the migrants. Why to defend this country when you can go to a different one? And I do believe from this point of view, when we talk about migration, it's quite important to see that we are very much focused on the mobility of the lower classes, in a certain way, people without possibility, without resources, who decided that it's much easier to change the country than to change their government. But on the other side, this is very much provoked also by the high mobility of the elites. And as a result of it, I do believe that the problem of the nationalization of the elites is also what most of the populists are coming. Look at Russia, which is a different case, but one of the first things that came with the new policies coming from Moscow was exactly the nationalization of the elites. If you want to have the right to steal in Russia, be sure that your money and your kids are going to be back. This story of the 1990s, where you basically are in the country, but your elites are out, your kids are out, and so on. So now you can see some of the major figures in the government were basically forced to bring their kids back. Nevertheless, some of these kids have not spent in the country many of these years. And I do believe that this type of a thing of what is ours is becoming critically important. I do believe in the United States you can see this very much with the technology companies. Whose company Google is, whose company Facebook is. And this is going to be a major problem of globalization, because on one level, you cannot allow basically Google not to tell American intelligence certain things that are very key to the American security. On the other side, of course, Google's possibility to succeed outside of the United States is very much preconditioned on the fact that people believe that they are not going to give the American intelligence many of the information that they have. And I do believe this critical problem of globalization is very much now focused on the nature of the elites. How they're going to be, I do believe simply the elites should show that they care much more for the people that have been electing them.
I think you said in the book, and I love this quote, the new elites are trained to govern, but not taught to sacrifice. And you gave the example of the British in the First World War. And I wrote in my notes, where is the accountability? And I think this is the challenge of, in some ways, the meritocracy that seems to be so divorced from the community and serving the community. We used to say, service before self, which brings us to sort of the question of leadership. If you hear this once, you hear it 1,000 times, where's the leadership in Europe? Where's the leadership here in the United States? And in the book, you talk about this challenge of leadership, that there's the elite believe that there's a communication problem. I think that's sort of the victim of when things aren't going well. We've got great policy, we're just not telling our story well enough, versus this demand for loyalty, this demand for sacrifice. We keep asking for this new leadership. What does that new leadership look like?
Listen, if you go back to one of my favorite books in social sciences, this is an old book from the 1970s, Hirschman's Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And he basically makes a what is distinction between people behavior in the market and in politics. And he said, listen, I'm very much trivializing in order to make my argument, but it's a great book, also a short one. But he basically said, when people are disappointed and disaffected with certain developments, they have two ways to react. One is to leave. For example, when you don't like certain product, for example, certain shampoo, it's quite rare that you're going to start writing letters to the producers and say, do it better. You simply start buying another shampoo. And because by stopping buying them, you're sending a signal to the company that something is going wrong, and they have a chance to react. In politics, he said, the problem is that there are certain things that you cannot change in the way you're changing shampoos. They are loyalty. They are your party loyalty, your national loyalty, your religious loyalty. So from this point of view, you go not for exit, but for voice. You're starting from inside to change something, because this community is very important to you. What I do believe has happened is that in the political arena, we started more and more to behave in the way we're behaving on the market. If you see how much often and how much easier it is for the people to change the party for which they're voting. This is why the new parties are doing so well and so on. So for people like Hirschman and for his generation, loyalty was taken for granted. By the way, this is the term on which he didn't elaborate more. And this is a German Jew who came to the United States, who is famously saying, anytime I was going through on my way to America, somebody was dying because he helped me. So this type of a loyalty to the group was extremely important. It could be ethnic loyalty, it could be also very much political loyalty. Now this loyalty is very much diminished. And people start to react all the time by exiting. And this is a huge problem for the leadership, because the leadership is very much based on the idea that there is a loyal community. Listen, democracy, nobody can imagine democracy working if you cannot answer the most simple question. Why the voters of the party that lost the election stay with it? There should be something in this. Why they stay with the party that lost? Why they don't go for a new party, when they don't move to the winning party, and so on. So there should be a certain level of loyalty, which in my view is critically important. And I do believe this is what in our societies, how to have a loyalty which is not totally exclusive. Because one of the things that is happening with democracy in Europe, and this is very easily seen in Central and Eastern Europe, is in 1990, we assumed that democracy and democratic institutions are about including people. Now the same institution, of course, has the potential to exclude. I was talking a lot to the Polish colleagues, because in Poland, trust in political leaders is not very high. For example, Mr. Kaczynski is not trusted by 80% of the population. But then why people who are mistrustful to their political leaders are ready to give so much power, agreeing for dismantling of the courts, for basically pressure on the media? Why they are not afraid of concentration of power if you don't trust so much the people who is concentrating? And the answer that I got was one of the most interesting things that I ever heard. For people on the street, separation of power is alibi for the elites to explain why they cannot do this or that. The government can say, I cannot do this because the central bank is not allowing me. I cannot do it because of the European Union. I cannot do it because of the courts. So people said, okay, we should give them a lot of power in order to have the possibility to keep them accountable. So they are not going to have an excuse why they are not doing what we ask them to do. The only problem with this logic is that when you give somebody so much power, there is no guarantee that it's going to return it to you. But otherwise, I do believe this is interesting for the accountability issues. We normally, particularly in political science, we talk about accountability much more as institutional checks up. For people, this is how much my vote matters.
So as I reflect on sort of looking at the constitutional changes that have occurred in Hungary and looking what's occurring in Poland today, I see it, I can understand why the people are saying, well, we will remove the roadblocks to getting greater effect, greater control. I see these individuals trying to eliminate opposition completely. And what we see in Hungary and Poland, for example, there is no left in either country. It is now a fight between right parties. And so, yes, while the argument for let's remove the reasons, all the reasons why I can't do things, but that's really not, in my view, the principal motivation of the actors that are trying to suppress those.
This is not why the prime minister are trying to concentrate power. For me, the question is why people who do not trust these prime ministers are allowing them to do it. Why otherwise people want to concentrate power. I do believe that it was David Frum in an article in The Atlantic some months ago who made a very interesting distinctions between the classical authoritarianism from, for example, the pre-war period and the one that we have now. In the classical authoritarianism, the old authoritarian used their power to put in prison innocent people. In the new authoritarianism, the problem is that those in power are allowing people that should be in prison to stay out. And this is a very different one. The logic is very different. And I do believe this is quite important because when you concentrate quite a lot of power and when you do certain things in order to do it, then leaving power is not an option. Look, for example, in the Balkans, there was a period in the 1990s particularly, from the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s, being re-elected was almost as difficult to be resurrected, with the exception of Montenegro, where government never succeeded to lose elections. And then it started a period in which re-election starts to come almost everywhere. For the government, started to become very difficult to lose elections. And I do believe this is also something, by the way, the weakness of the opposition is, in my view, in this situation, is one of the most understudied things in political science. It's everywhere, starting with the Democratic Party in this country. Why the opposition is so ineffective, even in a situation where you can have a lot of anger in society. And obviously, we're talking about something deeper. And for example, in places like Poland and Hungary, and Poland and Hungary are very different, I mean, to be honest. But Poland is a great example because Poland is defeating everybody who tries to explain the rise of populism in economic terms only.
Yes.
Financial crisis does not explain why Poles vote in the way they voted, because there was no recession in Poland. People normally like to talk about social inequality explaining everything. Social inequality narrowed in Poland for the last 10 years. So it was also not social inequality. Obviously, we're talking about something different. And I do believe talking about the nature of the resentment, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, is also something to be taken very seriously, because I was in Germany before the elections for a week, traveling with Bosch Foundation organized a group of foreigners to try to get a feeling what is going on. And we went to East Germany. And we were talking to a mayor of a small town, and so on and so on. And he made the following statement. He said, they want us to integrate Syrians. Fine. But why they don't try to integrate us first? So paradoxically, for us, everything that is happening with the alternative for Germany was the reaction to the people that came. But in a certain way, some major disappointment and resentment coming from the reunification process are coming back. And I do believe you can see this all over Central and Eastern Europe. And the funny story is when we talk about people leaving, and Andreas is here, but there is no positive correlations between economic performance and the number of people who left. For example, one of the countries that have been most depopulated in the last 10 years, economically very successful Baltic states. Almost more than 10% of the population of some of the Baltic republics left the country for the last 10 years. And why I'm saying this? Because when everybody is leaving your country, the very fact that you're staying there, nevertheless how well you're doing, creates you the feeling of a loser. I do believe if you go back, I remember very much the generation of my parents who came from the village to the city. This is what happened in the villages. In the 60s and 70s, basically, people who decided to stay in the villages, they have the feeling that they're losers simply because they're there, not because their way of life and their incomes has collapsed and so on and so on. And this new status politics, in my view, is something that we failed to get, and this is why some of the resentment came as a big surprise. And this is now, I'm afraid that many in the Western Europe are going to start talking about ungrateful East Europeans and so on. We transferred so much money to them and they're reacting like this and so on. This is not helping much. Plus, you're going to see this now in Eastern Europe, and I do believe it's a legitimate argument. They said, yes, we're getting money from them, but also all the money that we invest in our educational system goes for educating people who then starts to work in Germany. So we're also investing in the German economy quite a lot because we're creating the human capital which is moving there. So from this point of view, the East-West divide, in my view, is going to be more important than the North-South divide that came out of the financial crisis. And it's not by accident that even the Roman Empire did not basically split on the South and North. It split on the East and West. And if the things goes bad, the only difference is going to be that this time probably Warsaw is going to be Constantinople.
Ivan, I want to just, before we open up to questions, I know our audience has as many questions as I do. At the end of the book, you talk about referendums. And if you sort of say, in some ways, the European Union has been slowly, I'll use these terms, committing suicide by the series of referendum as the elite attempt to regain legitimacy as populism grows. This direct democracy, and you cite the three most recent. You talk about the Italian referendum that failed, the Dutch referendum that didn't fail, and then the Hungarian referendum on migration, which failed and in some ways didn't fail. How are these, in your view, how the referendum are destabilizing, the Brexit referendum being certainly the most glaring. Yet I'm struck by the fact that the reason that the European Union does not have treaty change, which it needs to capture all of the change that have occurred since the financial crisis and all the banking unions, is because they fear that they will go back to the referendum that killed the EU constitution in 2005 and the French. So their problem is to move forward and integrate. they have to go back to the people, and the people may very well reject this. So the more Europe can happen, they can't go backwards. They really are stuck where they are. And so this unease democratically with the direction that they're going, but to move forward and hopefully to get the gains from the project, they can't.
No, listen, for me, let's start with the fact. For me, the Brexit is the easiest problem. I do believe it's legit. I didn't like the result. It's not up to me to like it or to dislike it. I'm not voting there. But it's a real referendum. Basically, people should say, do they want to stay in a community or not? What worries me about is a kind of a small, meaningless referendums which are used by a proxy for other things. For example, in Netherlands, they have a referendum on the association agreement with Ukraine. Probably in this room, only one person has ever read this, and we know who he is. But the problem is that for the public, this is a non-issue. But it's a small symbolic referendum in which you want to show that European Union does not work here and there. So some people vote. Of course, they don't vote on the Ukrainian association agreement. They try to express their view of the current elites, of the situation, of the fact that they feel powerless, God knows on what. Because the governments can ask the question, but they never can know what is the question that people answer on the referendum. And then you have the Hungarian referendum. Listen, normally people go on a referendum where they don't know where people stand. On migration, there was quite clear where people stand. So you're making a referendum to tell something to Brussels, not to understand where your people stand. The only problem is that European Union cannot survive as the union of the referendums, because the referendum is the final verdict of the nation. They cannot negotiate. Referendums cannot negotiate with each other. And from this point of view, European Union is a negotiation space. The moment when you move to the referendums, this type of flexibility is destroyed. And I'm saying this because from this point of view, the Catalonia case was also incredibly interesting. Right. Listen, it's very kind of brutal what I'll say, but what Rajoy did in his logic, no, I do believe legally he's right, and basically fragmentation of Spain is not going to help anybody, but the way he handled the Catalonia referendum is not very much different than the way Yanukovych handled the protest on the Maidan. You try to show strengths, and by trying to do it, you create a crisis, political crisis, which is much deeper than the one that you had. And the paradox of the European Union is normally people said, oh, if European Union is going to disintegrate back to the nation states. If European Union is going to disintegrate, many of the existing nation states are not going to survive in the existing borders. And it's not only Spain. Look around and imagine for how many of them the existence of the European Union is preconditions for their territorial integrity. From this point of view, even the way the Scottish issue came up in Britain after the Brexit and so on, shows that the nation states were not weakened by the European projects. They have been very much re-legitimized, and Alan Millard was, in my view, the one best to express in his famous book, Rescuing the Nation State. Yeah.
Last final reflection on the results of the German election, and I think your East-West analogy as you look at the results in former East Germany, where AfD and Die Linke really clobbered the mainstream centrist parties, despite incredible wealth transfer, despite that resentment. Yeah. But help us understand where you think now, as the hard work begins in beginning to constitute a new government, and what does this look for the future of Europe if this German coalition government is really not able to help make and drive significant decisions that Europe will have to decide, specifically on migration and borders?
Paradoxically, I do believe one of the things that is going to happen is that on migration, there are much more consensus in Europe now than it used to be before. And the Chancellor Merkel was re-elected not so much because of the fact that she opened the borders, basically getting 1 million people in need, but because she shows that she can also has the capacity to close the border when certain limit was reached. She had this very famous statement during the election campaign in which she said, "I don't regret what I did, but I promise that I'm never going to do it again." Why I'm saying this? Because in a certain way, unlike Hungary or Poland, or my own country, Bulgaria, who didn't get much more refugees, arguing for tough border politics looks very vulnerable. The idea is if you're just getting 1,000 people, by the way, you don't have the possibility to do it. But when Germany took 1 million in this type of a generous gesture, when they come with the idea that the border should be kind of a much more toughened, it looks totally different. So from this point of view, Germany, strangely enough, is going to adopt some of the policy of its critics. But this is but it is going to be also at the expense of much more tensions also in the West-East relationships. Because what the Chancellor cannot allow is to make the migration on which the parties from both far left and far right are going to destroy the political center. And this is not going to be an easy coalition between the Liberals and the Greens and the Christian Democrats. And from this point of view, it's going to be much more how to survive in Germany than how to basically change Europe. In my view, is going to be one of the story. The fact that the Chancellor probably has her last term, at least this is what she said, is going mainly to make her more brave on certain issues, but it's going to make her party even more conservative on others because they don't know who is going to come next. So from this point of view, but this is my last point, because when you go to all these disintegrations, Soviet, Yugoslav and others, only one thing comes to, in my view, as a logic and as a rule. First, disintegration probably starts on the periphery, but it always ends up with the revolt of the center. It was not the Baltic republics who ran away out of the Soviet Union, the disintegrated Soviet Union. This was the decision of the Russian Federation, basically, to get control and to go for an optimal union with the Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan that destroyed de facto the union. And secondly, anytime when you have a choice between rigidity and flexibility, if you bet for rigidity, the risk for destroying is much higher. And here is where I see the problem with the German position, because when East Europeans criticize the Germans on migration, they're wrong on substance, in my view, exactly because of the small numbers we talk about. But they were right on one thing. During the financial crisis, the German government said, their rules. Don't break the rules. Don't break the rules. But during the migration crisis, they decided unilaterally to break the rules. And then the fear in small Central East European country was, if they can decide on migration without consulting us, on what else they can do it. And from this point of view, this power dynamics is quite interesting. It's quite subtle. And the drama and the tragedy of Central and Eastern Europe is that because of the governments that we have in Hungary and Poland, because of the things that they did in their domestic politics, even some of their legitimate arguments now can be very easily dismissed by the West. Because when you say, it's not Kaczynski and Orban to teach me this and that, it is true because of what they're doing inside of their countries. But on some of the common policies, some of these governments has legitimate arguments to make.
Absolutely. I'm reflecting on Anders' paper. This was several years ago. He studied how currency unions collapsed, and he looked at the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and the conclusion, if I may, sir, is that the strongest always leave first.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's never the weakest, and that's always for me, the most telling. All right, I could monopolize this man's time, and I've been doing too much of it. So let's get some questions, please. Please raise your hand and your affiliation. I'm going to take a bunch, and you have a pen, and we'll take it. So we'll start down maybe with Anders, since we used his name in vain here.
Anders Åslund, the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much. As always, extremely stimulating, and particularly I see this as a lovely brainstorming. I'll pick up on your first point. I would put it differently, the problem with Brussels, because if you look up on the problems of Brussels, they're very similar to Washington. But Europe, as you said, is very much a meritocratic bureaucracy, while the US is increasingly becoming an hereditary plutocracy, in particular this administration. And I think while the problem we see is similar, and I would say more, there's no media contact. Brussels does not communicate with the countries much through the media, and the media does not report what is happening in Brussels. There's no common European discussion in the media, and therefore there is no contact, there is alienation, and the European, even commissioners, see themselves as bureaucrats so, rather than politicians. So they don't make statements as politicians do. And the European parliamentarians are basically unknown. So I would put it there. If I may, one other point, that's immigration from the Baltics. I've just been to Riga twice the last month. And it looks quite different. The big thing is not growth. Growth is wonderful, but it is relative wages. Why stay in Latvia if you earn 3 times more if you go to Germany? You go to Germany. So it's the relative wages rather than the growth rate. And then you have a big language problem. In the provinces in Latvia, they learn English. English is not used in Riga. They use Russian. And the Latvians in the provinces no longer learn Russians. So they are at a disadvantage in Riga. So therefore they go abroad. So it's ethnic Latvians who are leaving more than Russians because Riga is booming. And Central Europe really looks about as bad as Bulgaria or the Balts, but it's hidden by a mass immigration of Ukrainians. And Ukrainians are so similar to Poles. In fact, often they are ethnic Poles. So you don't distinguish it. There are at least 2 million Ukrainians in Poland. Thank you.
Thank you. Max, we'll just pass that down. We'll grab a couple of these. Yes, sir, please.
Thank you. My name's Austin Doler. I'm a master's student at the Elliott School. You mentioned AFD and your overall thesis that the immigration crisis will be Europe's undoing, essentially. To what extent could we see the Christian Democrats looking to the right on the immigration issue in order to win back AFD voters in the East? And if they try that, how much will their coalition with a party like the Greens allow them to do that? Thank you.
Great. And is there one right there? Okay, we have 2 over here. Yes, please. Oh, Nicholas, please.
Nicolas Veron at the Peterson Institute here in Bruegel in Brussels. First, thanks for being here. I have 2 questions on Central and Eastern Europe. One is, how plausible do you view now the scenario of Mr. Kaczynski trying to drag Poland outside of the EU and do an equivalent of Brexit for his country? The other one is, clearly at this point, Poland and Hungary stand out in terms of their attitude to the EU, and you mentioned that. How likely do you view a scenario in which there would be contagion of this attitude to other Central and Eastern European member states of the EU, and which member states are the ones to watch in that respect? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we had one more up here. Matt, sir, did you have one? We'll just let you fire away.
Hi, good morning, Joe Gallagher. I'm interested to hear what your take is on the role of the common currency as a protagonist or antagonist for integration or disintegration.
Great. We'll let you take that round. And one thing we did not talk about, but I wanted to highlight, was really the role that technology, really the social media, and how it both fans the flames of populists and its use, but how it has affected this whole challenge of populism and democratic legitimacy. But you've got a lot on your plate, so I'll let you get started.
So let's start with Andres first, and because I took it as a comment. There is one thing that and this is very clearly seen from where I come. The migration crisis stirred the demographic fears of small nations who are aging and depopulating. In a certain way, we discovered our mortality. The question is, in 100 years, anybody going to speak Bulgarian? Is a metaphysical issue, but basically people start fearing because almost 2 million, the statistics is very unreliable, but around 2 million has left the country in the last 25 years, and according to the UN projections, in the next 20 years, we're going to lose 27% of our population. The other issue, which is in my view very important, particularly to the migration fear, is you see Central European countries, unlike Germany, do not trust the capacity of their state to integrate. And the reason is the Roma population. Central Europe, we failed integrating the Roma massively. If you see how many of the Roma kids are out of school, how much out of the market, the question comes, if we cannot integrate the Roma, why do you believe that we can integrate all these people coming from outside. And I do believe this is quite important because this is kind of mistrust in the state which you have basically makes these fears even bigger. Because I just want to jump on this, but the demographic fears in a certain way go parallels to the technological fears. And the technological fear is first, according to the recent UK study, in the next 30 years, 43% of all the existing jobs in the European Union are going to be automated. Is it true or not, I don't know. But the problem of these studies is that if, in a certain way, the demographic imagination imagines a world without us, this type of a technological imagination basically creates the world without jobs for us. And listen, and of course we know that new jobs are always created after technological revolutions and others, but don't forget that this type of a loss of jobs is going to come with a much more aging population in Europe, for which changing jobs is not going to be so easy. I was trying to explain my daughter what is a stenographer. She didn't know this, but in the beginning of the 20th century, this was one of the most prestigious professions, particularly if you're a young girl coming from not very rich family, because you're going to have a certain professional realization, and even you're going to end up with a good marriage. I'm saying all this because the fear that you're kind of squeezed between technology and demography is much stronger in Europe than in other places. And here comes the new communication. I was, on one level, anytime when you basically see what is happening on the level of social media, control of social media, and so on, pushes us to ask several very important questions. For example, we always start with the assumption, do you remember even 5 years ago, all these articles about, for example, liberation technologies? My friend Larry Diamond and so on. So the idea was that the new technologies are a very natural ally of democracy and for empowering people. On one level, it's true. But on the other level, new technologies, and particularly social media, solve one of the biggest problems any authoritarian regime has, namely the access to reliable information. And if you see what the Chinese are doing, not so much Russians to be honest, but what the Chinese are doing, the level of sophistication is amazing. For example, if you're a Chinese blogger and you're writing some critical story and basically revealing certain corruption in local government, you're not going to be punished for this, just the opposite. The government is going to work with the information. You're going to be punished only if you ask your friends to go and to protest in front of the council building. So what they're sanctioning is only collective action. They're not sanctioning information. And as a result of it, we live in a world in which there is no need for police informers anymore, because today people are informing on themselves all the time. They say how they feel, what they shop, and so on. So this type of a big data, in my view, is totally changing the idea of politics. Plus, and I do believe this is part of the reason of, in my view, also kind of an explosion of security in the United States as a result of the Russian hacking. We like to talk borders. The most difficult border to protect is the information borders. Governments used to have a monopoly over the opinion of their voters. And suddenly you realize that in the existence of big data, other people's governments are going to have as much access to your voter as you have. And from this point of view, you're trying to see an attempt to build borders, not simply physical walls against the immigrants, not simply a trade walls with some of the new protectionist politics. One of the interesting stories is how you create an information borders. And one of the interesting stories is that you create an information borders by creating a collective national conspiracy theories. Go basically to some of the countries. By the way, do you know what is the strongest predicator for who has voted for the governing party in Poland, for Peace Party these days? It's not education, it's not income.
Smolensk.
It is the belief that what happened in Smolensk was assassination. Why I'm saying this? Because in a certain way, conspiracy theories started to play the same role that ideologies used to play before. They start to give identity. The only difference is that you can be a dissident with respect to ideology, but you cannot be a dissident with respect to conspiracy theory, because conspiracy theory does not have a future dimension. There is no normative dimension. It gives you explanation, but there is no future project, so you cannot criticize from the point of view of future and certain type of norms. And I find this type of a story much more interesting than the pure technological story with social media and others. We're simply entering a new world, we don't know how to do it, and it scares us. And I do believe this scare is very much real. On East German vote and AfD, to be honest, I'm not a real specialist on this, but there is one interesting story. GDR, the major identity of the German Democratic Republic was their anti-fascism. Ask them who they are. This was the anti-fascist German state. Why it is so easy for people who keep certain type of a loyalty to the GDR to vote for a party which basically is quite uncritical, let's put it like this, to the Nazi period. I don't believe it, but they made these statements and so on. And I find this quite interesting because normally we try to talk about far left, far right, as if the left-right decision helps us as it used before. Many of the economic policy of the left are now coming from the right. And many of the certain type of traumas and sentiments that have been typical for the right, you can find also on the far left. For example, strong mistrust towards the state, which was not the case basically of the traditional left. So from this point of view, the very map with which we look at these parties does not help much. There was a major difference. I made this point, but I want to stress it because for me this was one of the things that I got out of all these elections, and particularly the German ones. There was a disappointment and anger both in the east of Germany and in the west of Germany. On the level of the proportion, probably it was not even so different. By the way, the Chancellor Merkel was overrepresented and basically won the elections mainly through the support of a very particular group, women older than 60. This is the constituency in which she outperformed everybody by a big margin. But in the western part of this vote went to the liberals, which doubled. So the protest vote stays in the kind of a broad understood mainstream. In Eastern Europe, it went very much basically to AfD. The Linke also was there, but basically they didn't change much their vote. So, and also don't forget, both AfD and the liberals managed to mobilize people who didn't vote on the last elections. So, but if some years ago we can talk about these parties as a protest parties, the truth is that now they have a much more clear profile than before. Is there something that common currency? Listen, on common currency, I'm just going to give you, this is not my field at all, but I do believe that what we see, for example, in Spain, to a certain extent was the result of there is no alternative policy and the way the common currency was solved. Because during the Eurozone crisis, the idea was you can vote what you want, but there is certain macroeconomic policies that you should follow, because in European politics, macroeconomic policies are constitutionalized in the way the human rights are, the 3% budget deficit. As a result of it, parties should compete on something. When you are not competing on the field of economy, it becomes much more identity politics. So when you are telling them there is no economic alternative, they said then the independent Catalonia is the alternative. So in my view, the problem with the common currency is that paradoxically, probably economically, it makes much more sense, but from the political point of view, it fuels the rise of identity politics because of the major constraints it puts on the political competition.
Well, all I can say is an hour spent with Ivan Krastev is an hour exceptionally well spent. Thank you for...
It depends which part of the day.
Oh, oh, we're glad we caught you on the morning. But no, thank you. Wonderful food for thought. Congratulations on After Europe. It is a thought-provoking book that it deserves to be reread and thought through, and it helps give us a framework for understanding both Europe and, I have to say, understanding the United States. So thank you for those insights, and please join me in thanking Ivan Krastev.
Thank you very much.